Hi, my name is Christy Sutton, and the article I read is The History of Curriculum or Curriculum History. What is the field and who gets to play on it? By Bernadette Baker. So, what is in a name? Although the article that I read was written in 1996, Baker compared two other authors' works, Musgrave and McCulloch, and both of their articles were articles on curriculum history based in the 1980s and written about Australia and New Zealand. And so, since it was not based in curriculum history in the US, I'm interested to see the other articles that everyone else read and see how closely it relates to this one, since it's based on the curriculum history of Australia and New Zealand. And so, one of the concepts was what is history of curriculum and curriculum history. And both authors that Baker discussed had different ideas about it. Both of them agreed that curriculum history kind of began in the 1970s once mass schooling began and most of the population began going to school. Musgrave had the idea that curricula was mainly for secondary grades, that it was involved goal statements and subject matter, and every now and then would talk about a teaching method. And the focus here was on how actual history created curriculum. So a U.S. example would be, since Juneteenth was this weekend, of how did curriculum change because of the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. And so not necessarily the actual history of curriculum, but how did things that happened in history affect curriculum. And then McCulloch had a different viewpoint of more of an actual timeline of curriculum changes. And so the study of curriculum is based on how, like, historical and social theoretical models. And so how the idea behind it was more of how is the way history studied can be contributed to the way we're going to study curriculum. And so it was kind of two different viewpoints going through the entire article. And so the critical issue and the important topic were kind of the same for me, and that was the labeling of curriculum history. And since it was not very clear from the beginning of the article that can hide different practices and interpretations that researchers may mean when they are discussing curriculum history. If I'm discussing it and so are you, we may have a different idea of what we're even talking about. And so if that can actually be defined, then how do we know the boundaries of curriculum history and what that involves? And therefore, how can it be used across national contexts? We're talking about Australia and New Zealand, as other articles are talking about the US. But if the idea doesn't have a definition, then can those be interrelated? Can we learn from each other if we have a different idea of what we're even discussing? And so first is, what is the field? And so again, there were different viewpoints about what the field of curriculum history is and where it belongs. Musgrave thinks it should fall under the framework of sociology of knowledge. McCulloch said it's a social and political field. The U.S. was mentioned in this section as being more of a political and administrative driven instead of curricula driven because of the American revisionist history of focus on equality in curriculum studies. And so since the U.S. at the time was focused on equality, they said that it was more of a social and administrative viewpoint of curriculum. Both seem to take the idea of curriculum history and make it its own field of study instead of actually focusing on improving schooling, which is kind of my idea of curriculum history, and the point of it is to improve schooling. But that's how they took it. And McCulloch mentioned that curriculum history should not worry with the complexity, failure, or disappointment that English stress in their studies of curriculum. And so we'll get to more of that in a minute. The author did mention 3 major contributions that historical studies of the evolution of school knowledge could make. The first one is to improve knowledge of school curriculum involving the definition and promotion of school subjects and how they change over time. The second is to explain the anti-research tradition among teachers. And the third is to inform and influence policy and practice. So from there, I have our first 2 discussion questions. And the first one is, why would one want to include failures and disappointments in its history? And so one of the authors, and luckily the author of the article, Baker, disagreed with this part of her writing, in that why would you not include your failures and disappointments in history? That's part of your history. Of when you're thinking about the history of something, the failures and disappointments are part of it. Without mistakes, you don't learn and grow, and then you're doomed to repeat it. And so the parts of our curriculum that didn't work well should be recorded, discussed, learned from, and therefore not repeated. I feel like we should want to include our failures and disappointments in our curriculum history so we know where to go from there. And then the author cited another author, Goodson, and his contributions to curriculum history. And one of those was that the dominant anti-research tradition of teachers. And this one kind of took me back a little bit because I am a teacher and I am interested in research. So I've been a teacher for 13 years. And whereas I've not yet conducted my own major research study, I read research and I apply research studies in my classroom. And all of our curriculum materials that we teach on in our classrooms are based on research. All of the intervention methods that we use are based on research. Even the way we do our report cards are based on research. And so I would like to know your viewpoints on, are teachers really anti-research, or do they just not take the time to do research themselves? This was another part that I feel like could have been clarified a little bit better because I did not agree with that statement. And so we have our field. So now who is playing on our field? And the focus towards the end of the article on who is playing was on the mainstream curriculum history is a field by Anglo-Western men, and it was written for Anglo-Western men. That minorities were not mentioned, women are not mentioned. It ignored evidence of children and of schooling and improving in school learning, how they learn, all of that was ignored. That curriculum history was viewed as a teacher's account of another teacher, or an administrator's account of another administrator, or someone in academics account of someone else in academics. And so it was more comparing people to people instead of practices. And then it was basically men writing for other men to read. And so this leads into my third discussion question of, are the players still Anglo-Western males, and is the focus still very little on the actual pupil? And so based on what was brought up, how do you feel about this? I feel like it's improving, but it's, in regards to our history is still basically the Anglo-Western male writing our curriculum history, because we've just now started having more women and more minorities in university settings. And so I would say there's been a shift of thinking about curriculum from that side into incorporating more minorities and women in curriculum, so that in the future, our history will involve that. But right now, I don't see that. But I do see the focus changing from a sociological and political perspective. There's still always going to be politics in education, but the focus changing onto the people. And research now seems to be on the child and how the child learns and implications of that learning and how to help the teacher so that it's helping the student. Of our focus is more on students and how do they learn and what can we do as teachers and educators to help the child learn. The implications of history, of curriculum history, that this article and curriculum history just in general, from where we've been, is to learn from where we've been so that we can do better. Martin Luther King Jr. said we are not makers of history, but are made by history. And Robert Heinlein said a generation which ignores history has no past and no future. And so for me, this goes back to the discussion question of why we should include failures and disappointments. Of we have a history. No matter how good or bad that history is, we have one in every area of life. But we have one in curriculum history and theory, and we need to use it and we need to know it because we need to know what worked and what didn't work so that we can improve upon that and we can get better and learn from it. And so our children get a better education than we did, and their children get one even better than they did. We cannot ignore our history. We can't take the bad parts out of it. It happened. And so what can we do to make it better? And so that's what I think we can learn from this. And then personally, how I can use this in regards to my actionable work is to make sure I clearly define curriculum. Through the entire article that I read, there were two different viewpoints on curriculum history because they had two different ideas of what curriculum history even meant. And so when I'm working on my own research and writing my dissertation and things like that, I need to make sure my ideas, even though I may assume when I'm talking curriculum history, is talking about the actual timeline of historical events of curriculum and how it affects schooling, that they may not have that same idea. Of if I'm talking about a concept, it is clearly defined from the beginning of what I mean throughout. And that way there's no confusion, and any disagreements we have or discussions we have, we're on the same page of just making sure everything is clearly defined. And then my reference is the Baker article, The History of Curriculum or Curriculum History, What is the Field and Who Gets to Play on It, from the journal Curriculum Studies. Thank you.